Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on contracting risk for applicants and third parties in Latin America, organized by MultiLatin Background Screening. I'm Meritxell Vila, MultiLatin COO, and I'm pleased to moderate today's event. MultiLatin provides background screening for job applicants and compliance due diligence in Latin America and the Caribbean. We have more than 40 years of combined experience focused on protecting our clients' reputation and mitigating the risk implicit in their contracting processes. During this webinar, you will learn about the risks that companies face in their contracting process for applicants and third parties in Latin America. MultiLatin's 2019 Contracting Risk Index, which highlights some of the inconsistencies found during the background screening of applicants in 2018. And last but not least, the implementation of a corporate background check program. David Robillard, president of MultiLatin, will present this webinar. During the webinar, you can send us any questions you have through chat. We'll be answering some of them following David's presentation. If we run out of time for all the questions, we will answer those by email. So make sure that you've registered your email address correctly. You can also be part of the conversation on Twitter and LinkedIn using the hashtag MultiLatinRiskIndex and Civilize. Now, to continue with the program, let me introduce David Robillard. David has 20 years of experience advising companies on issues related to reputational risk and integrity. Since 2011, he has been president of MultiLatin Background Screening. Before forming MultiLatin, David held a number of management positions in international risk consulting, eventually serving as the Deputy Regional Managing Director for Latin America and the Caribbean. Between 2013 and 2015, he was president of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce in Mexico. David is a graduate of Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada, and received a master's in international management from the ITAM in Mexico City. He's president of the Risk Management Committee at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce in Mexico and chair of the Latin America Working Group for the National Association of Professional Background Screening, NAPBS. David's presentation is on contracting risk for applicants and third parties in Latin America. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Meritxell, and thank you to all of you who are joining us today. You know, the business world in which we operate presents many opportunities and risks. For 8 years, MultiLatin has had the mission of supporting companies in making better decisions when hiring employees and their third parties. And in this way, and through corporate background check programs, we support you in protecting your corporate reputation, preventing fraud, reinforcing company security, as well as meeting international standards of compliance. For this presentation, I'll focus first on the macro risks that concern companies in terms of fraud and theft, and second, present the findings from last year that our team of analysts identified and that we suggest you consider in the selection and hiring of job applicants in Latin America. According to the 2018 PwC Global Economic Crime and Fraud Study, in Latin America, 53% of the companies who were surveyed expressed having been the victims of fraud or economic crime. And of those companies, more than half of the crimes were committed by employees, and in the other half of the cases in which the companies were affected by external parties, 68% were committed by authorized third parties, such as channels, distributors, agents, as well as suppliers and clients. For this reason, we've provided a focus for our report this year on third parties and their labor. Based on these risks, the importance of the role of compliance has evolved and has never been more important. Compliance functions provide oversight and assurance to shareholders, executive governments, and society that the company is complying with governmental and industry regulations, as well as the rules established by their own companies. For our purposes, our focus is related to the compliance measures concerning the selection of job applicants for positions within their enterprises. It's a huge responsibility that typically does not receive the merits that these compliance officers well deserve. For example, for those of you from the Mexican banking sector, some have the responsibility to ensure compliance with the official regulation 57A of the federal law for public credit, which requires banks to adopt selection procedures that ensure that applicants demonstrate having the necessary technical qualifications, experience, as well as reputation to work in the Mexican banking system. More specifically, individuals who have been convicted of financial crimes, including theft, or having been barred from working in either the Mexican public sector or financial system are ineligible for working in banks. This is one of the few sectors in which there's an express regulation related to selection and implies background screening. The sector, as you can see, some criteria represent greater risks to a bank than is relevant to a company in another industry. And with that, their risk matrices for compliance-based selection processes and programs are built and implemented. Since 2014, MultiLatin has shared the analysis of its background screening operations in Latin America and the Caribbean. During our first 3 years, we based our reports on the inconsistencies that we found. Now, however, we realized that we could improve the value of our analysis if we considered the weighting of the risks faced by different industries, as well as the positions to be occupied by an applicant and the probability of detecting certain inconsistencies in the verifications. For these two reasons, MultiLatin has built the Contracting Risk Index as a tool to support clients in making effective decisions to select employees. For the second year in a row, we've continued our partnership with Lockton Mexico, leader in actuarial consulting, who endorsed the MultiLatin methodology and developed the algorithm to build our Contracting Risk Index. The 2019 Contracting Risk Index considers two factors. One, the inconsistencies found in the verification of candidates, as you can see on the left of your screen. And two, the weighting of risks that clients consider factors for exclusion within 5 sectors, including banking or financial services, infrastructure and mining, business process outsourcing with a focus on IT, professional services, and finally, the transport and logistics sector. Based on these factors, we generated a matrix in which the greatest impacts that can be received are reported for each of the industries for each of the validations. Now, I'm not going to go into all of this data on this call, but you will receive a copy of our report in which you can look at the detail at your own time. But what I will do for today's webinar is look at the most relevant findings that we think we'd like to share. Our team of analysts points out that the biggest impacts that we found were obtained in the business process outsourcing, or BPO sector, banking and finance, as well as the professional services sectors. Now, during the past years that we've published our reports, we've seen a significant decrease in the probability for inconsistencies in the identity of our applicants. We can attribute part of this trend to the background screening technology that we implemented in 2017, through which most applicant data is received. And in this way, we eliminate errors that happen with handwritten documents. I think technology today is a great factor for improving this process. The best example we've seen is in the financial services sector, which shows the lowest probability of an inconsistency in the region, while the BPO sector has the highest probability of inconsistencies. So it up to over 3% of applicants showing inconsistencies. Now, although the reception data is also through a platform, issues of incorrect or duplicate identity numbers continue to be presented. And I want to point out that the transport sector takes most seriously the implications of an identity problem. So as you can see on this slide, in the case using transport as an example, for them, identity has the highest implication if there's an inconsistency. And that has to do with the types of compliance regulations that they need to meet that ensure the person occupying a job truly is that same person. Now, what we can attribute, identity verification of an applicant represents the start of any background check. We have to ensure that the data of the person who's applying to the position corresponds to the same person. The theft of person's identity is not limited to the misuse of credit, which, you know, in today's world is one of the things that all of us are concerned with in terms of identity theft. Assuming someone's identity, whether they be alive or dead, is rather common for purposes of employment. We have seen cases of children, adult children, of course, using a custom broker's patent or even professional license from, whether it be from their father or their uncle, and using that as for their own purposes when presenting themselves to a client or to authorities. Typically, age differences and other attributes are noted. We had the example of an architect who presented himself with 30 years of professional experience in his portfolio of work, while the candidate himself didn't have more than 10 years of experience in the labor force. So you can see the differences, and also the utility of doing so. With the free movement of nationals from other countries within the region, multinationals worry if their candidate has the right to work in the country of employment. So this is a key issue on the use of identity. Now, in academic verifications, the professional services and the business and the BPO sectors have the highest level of risk of lies and inconsistencies. The financial services sector and infrastructure, which includes energy industry, also track in terms of having the lowest risks in Latin America. So we're looking at the BPO and professional services sectors have 3 times the probability of a risk of an inconsistency, and dare I say lie, in terms of the academic qualifications that an applicant presents. And for the transport sector, the average in the region is almost 6%. But as you can see, for them, it expresses the lowest implication in terms of the process of selecting applicants. So such inconsistencies can play out and not be factors of extreme exclusion. So, but let's point out something for the professional service sectors. For accounting firms, lawyers, engineers, and consultants, having a degree and a professional and a title is essential to practice their profession. Across the region, the only way to verify whether a university degree is valid is by contacting the school or where available, consulting an official Department of Education database where available. Now, we see on a daily basis very creative ways to falsify academic records, including Photoshop, which I think is one of the tools most widely available. But in the case of Mexico and Mexico City, a favorite for falsifications is the Santo Domingo market. The purchase of, and a newer trend that we are seeing in the region is the purchase of degrees online through diploma mills particularly located in the United States. For a mere $300, one can obtain either a master's degree, a doctorate, and the official from such school will answer the phone and verify that the degree exists. The fact is, the school doesn't exist, and that's the issue. In the case of one applicant for a programming position at a Mexican software company, we received a scan letter from a university stating that there was a fire at the school that destroyed the academic records. The applicant assumed that we were going to take the document at face value and use it as validation. Well, instead, of course, we contacted the school's registrar's office and learned that the letter was fake. In another case, by cross-referencing the applicant's identity documents and academic record, we discovered how he faked his degree. Very ingenious he was. The young applicant changed the first name, Photoshop, and altered the major on the degree that his brother earned from the same school. When we contacted the school, they were able to confirm this academic fraud by saying that they didn't have a graduate in accounting with that person's name. However, they did have a graduate in economics with the same surname. By looking at a little further at the applicant's social media profile, we're able to discover the when and how his brother obtained his degree and connect the dots. Now, in employment verification, based on our analysis, we identified the BPO sector present the greatest risk in the region for relevant inconsistencies. More than 20% of the candidates had inconsistencies on their experience, as well as the dates, the times which they stated that they held employment in those companies. Professional services, transport, and infrastructure sectors represented the next groups of most interest. But again, in the case of companies in the professional services sector, they took this issue put greater weight on it than those in the BPO sector, and a lot more than those in the transport sector. Lastly, the banking sector held the lowest risk in uncovering work experience, errors in the work experience. Typically, we find the cases of exaggerations of responsibilities, seniority, and positions. And in the past year, we've identified a recent trend with IT companies associated with BPO. Before, a candidate had 2 to 3 positions, perhaps during a 5-year search. Now, we can see IT candidates having up to 10 positions the same period, and that's what generates inconsistencies in the time gaps between one project and the other. And candidates, well, they try to reduce gaps by playing with the dates, stretching them from one side and the other. Another observation we have, particularly for BPO, is the fact that the companies themselves, your vendors of services, are very keen to place their person in your company. So our analysis is that they spend less time and less diligence in vetting their candidates because they have an incentive to make sure that that candidate is placed as quickly as possible. Now, criminal litigation. While the probability of detecting criminal litigation histories has remained consistent over the years, the professional services sector, and so as you can see, for 4 of the sectors, the probability of a risk in finding a match is approximately 1%. However, the professional services sector rises to 3.28%. It's 3 times as high, and companies in this sector take it just as seriously as those in the others. Litigation searches and verification represent one of the cornerstones of background screening process for most companies. In 2018, we detected more than 500 cases of candidates with relevant criminal litigation that represent a risk to our clients. We found records of robberies and frauds committed against their previous employers, family violence, as well as applicants appearing on government watch lists. It's very important to analyze the records to ensure that it also corresponds to the candidate and not be a false positive. That's within this process, one of the most important distinctions in background checks versus simply searching databases. Because treating an applicant unfairly and signaling that that person has an antecedent will, number one, increase your exclusion rate. So you'll be selecting fewer candidates, but with the wrong criteria. And two, could lead to unfair treatment of those applicants. Finally, the invisible employee, and this is going back to the subject or that we touched on at the beginning on third parties. One can consider that those BPO employees could be viewed as invisible employees. What do I mean by that? Well, you know, those individuals carrying out processes that have been outsourced to third parties, maybe implants, they may be remotely connected workers, and typically, and by design, many companies don't even know the people in charge of carrying out those processes. But those individuals do manage confidential data for their clients and sometimes sensitive data of personnel. They're the ones running your systems. They may be running your systems. They're the ones programming, also programming code, but they also could be the ones that provide all the backup for the cleaning and maintenance of your offices. But just like a direct employee, they have access to data and installations. So recognizing that they represent the same risk to your company as your direct employees, we highly recommend that you take measures for your third-party labor or invisible employees as you would for your direct employees. Consider the same level of diligence for them as you would your direct employees. Now, to face the risks associated with hiring employees, there's still a lot to do. In Mexico, this tracks with surveys conducted in other parts of Latin America. Less than a third of the companies have some form of selection processes in place that are effective at mitigating the risks in selecting their employees. This compares to NAPBS report or survey from 2018, which showed that in the United States, 95% of companies have effective screening programs. So we'd like to recommend that a robust program for selecting applicants should include, one, consent of the candidate to verify their experience and their background. A lot of companies that are looking at implementing background screening in the region consider the process that they are going, the process from the point of view of obtaining information. Well, without the proper consent, with the proper consent, you're then able to address the more important issues when you find something that will be used in order to not select that individual, because then you have properly documented your right to have obtained that information and take action on that information. Two, you should use technology that protects the personal data and facilitates the crossing of data for cross-referencing of data for further analysis. Today, I see so many companies, HR departments, still sharing applicant data through emails. You need to have a technology that encrypts the data, that provides you with the assurances that you're protecting the data of your applicants, but also you can demonstrate to an applicant in a future how you've managed it, but also destroyed it. And that's very important. Three, well, you need to have processes focused on the verification of information and not just check documents. Checking documents does not mitigate. And what I mean by that is, oh, I receive a document, check on a checklist. You need to validate that the document it really represents either their work experience, their academic experience, anything, the professional certification that's required. 4, well, consider the risks specific to your industry and the probabilities that affect the quality of your candidates. And finally, 5, make sure to align the norms and procedures regarding verification of candidates for your direct employees, but as well as your invisible or your indirect employees that will be working for your company through outsourcing arrangements. So those are that's an overview of our report and some recommendations on how to affect or implement an effective corporate background check program. Now I'm happy to open the floor to questions.
Thank you, David. As you mentioned, MultiLatin provides a solid perspective on the risk companies face in their contracting process for applicants in Latin America. The Contracting Risk Index is intended to be a useful tool for making decisions about applicant and third-party contracting processes. It also seeks to advance secure and contracting to protect the reputation of clients and reinforce security in the workplace. In 2018, according to MultiLatin's analysis, the trend towards outsourcing of operations increased. The employees of suppliers, known as invisible employees, which you talked about on your presentation, should be subject to the same screening standards as the company's own employees. Different positions require different screening levels based on the reputational and security risk that the company faces. In other words, we cannot do the same screening process for the different employees in our company. Now we'll take some of the questions that we've been receiving via, I believe, Twitter and LinkedIn. David, the first question that we have is the following: is it common in Mexico to apply a background check?
Thanks, Marichel. It is common to carry out some form of screening of candidates, but the paradigm has been, or the practice, better yet, the practice has been that companies have been more concerned with how someone lives, and as opposed to whether or not the information that they provide in their CV or including their degree is true. Estudios socioeconómicos, or social economic studies, have been the norm to today, but they don't mitigate risks. So the vast majority of companies conduct some form of selection process, but many are now seeing that those processes don't help them comply with the norms that their industry or government agencies are imposing.
I imagine especially the regulated ones, correct?
That's correct,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Okay. We have another question here from a person in the US that tells us, where is the greatest risk when an applicant falsifies information?
Well, for an accountant or an engineer, and I have some experience working in the engineering companies. If the person it claims to be an engineer, a professional engineer, and claims to have a professional number from which they can, that allows them to sign documents that support the calculation of stress for a bridge, or in the case of a director responsible for civil works, be able to determine whether or not the construction has been completed up to code. If the person lied about that, well, the company is on the line for the responsibility if something occurs to that project.
Thank you. We have another question. What is the process for verifications? Talking about the invisible employees, is there any code or law to require to my supplier to do this verification?
Most specifically, companies that wish to transfer their procedures or their policies to their suppliers need to put it into their contracts. So they can be very specific in their services contracts to state that any employee that will work on for their company needs to have been submitted to a thorough background check. And you can even specify to what scope of work, what scope of verifications.
Thank you. We have another one from Chile this time. What do you consider to be a more serious inconsistency? The omission of a previous job or lying about having received a university degree?
Great question. Well, number one, the vast majority of the lies on university degrees occurs when perhaps someone claims to be, let's say, having had received their degree, but in fact they completed all their studies, but they just didn't. Perhaps they didn't complete their thesis, or they didn't complete a final step, which can be sometimes pretty onerous in the region. So depending on how many on the level of studies, of completion of studies, depending on whether or not it's a professional degree as opposed to liberal arts degree, and the risk that exposes the company. So that's one issue. Now, many people, particularly young people, omit work experience because maybe it was working at a Starbucks or working at a McDonald's in a services industry, but not related to their job, and they think that it's not relevant. So you have to take it case by case. If somebody omits a job and that something really bad happened at that job, well, that's a really strong finding. And but at the end of the day, it's the companies need to, and when they're constructing their risk matrices or discrepancy criteria, they can determine what for them is stronger.
Correct. Thank you. We have another question. What are some of the bases for developing a risk matrix?
Well, let me put that one to you, Mary-Jo. You're as head of operations for MultiLatin. You have the most experience working with clients' matrices.
What I would say would be that the most important thing is what the client considers to be a red flag. So different clients consider different types of red flags, and that would be the most important thing when considering a risk matrix. Obviously, it all falls, what we were talking about, on the position of the candidate. It's not the same when we contract a lawyer that we need in our company, a CFO, a secretary, or somebody that would be in the cleaning team for the company. So that is the most important thing that I would say. When we look at a risk matrix, we need to look at the different positions and the different risks that the companies face in the market. One example would be, if it's a pharmaceutical company, they need to have to be, for example, if they need biologists or chemistry candidates or stuff like that, they need to have a title. They need to have had some sort of title finished at the university that allows these people to conduct a job within a pharmaceutical company. If we have, for example, somebody that is going to be in an accounting firm, we need candidates that have the completed degree, meaning they hold the title and they have the degree, the finished degree with the thesis and everything, because they need to sign some papers. So it will depend on the industry and the company. So I don't know if you want to add anything,
No,
David?
I'm fine.
Okay. So we have another question.
Sort of a two-part question.
A two-part question, exactly. It can be discriminatory to use a background check. And then the second part of the question is, for example, if you have a criminal record and you're free, it would be discriminatory not to hire this candidate?
Let me take the first question of the introduction. Is it discriminatory to use background check? Well, it's really important that the concept of discrimination is a legal term that varies from country to country. And as I pointed out, there's several different types of verifications that one can conduct within a background check. So to answer that, it's definitely not discriminatory to verify that someone has verify their employment history or their academic history. The second part of the question is if you have is very specific, because the issue of criminal and credit verifications are regulated differently in different countries. And what's complicated, the question here is, if you have a criminal record and you're free, is it discriminatory not to hire you? Well, frankly, as I pointed out, if you work in the banking sector, by law, you cannot work. You cannot hire someone with a criminal record for that sector. So it depends, and the issue really starts with that the company's risk matrix, or in Spanish, and I don't know the Portuguese term, but in Spanish, the regla interno de trabajo, the internal work policy, justifies the risks, based on the risks, justifies what needs to be reviewed prior to as part of the selection process.
Thank you, David. We have another question from Mexico this time. What law are we protected by to do a background screening on an employee in Mexico?
Great question.
Due to the privacy laws in Mexico.
Well, let's start with the end of your question. So related to the privacy laws, this is why it's so important to obtain the consent of the candidate. You as an employer need to obtain a consent of the candidate in order to share their share their personal data, their private data, with a company like ourselves for the express purposes of screening or checking the information that they've provided. That's number one. That's how you provide protection to you as an employer for related to the privacy law. Second, you need to really understand what laws govern your business, and in the case Mexico and other countries, the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Transportation and the Ministry of Finance all have laws that are very clear in terms of the criteria for eligibility of a job applicant. In the case of health, it governs in risks on safety sensitive positions the use of drug testing, and why and where can drug testing be used on an applicant. I've already mentioned the banking sector, and then finally in transport sector, again it related to drug and alcohol use, is specific to drivers in that sector.
Great, thank you, David. We have one more question. There has been a great debate about including social media checks in a verification process. What's your point of view on the ethics of going through an applicant's Facebook or Twitter account?
Great question. Number one, it's really important. I think looking at the social media profile of an individual is quite relevant for certain positions. It can be relevant across the board, but frankly, if you have an applicant, let's think of an applicant for a C-suite position, for vice president and above. Well, it's going to be really important to see what has that person said. What has that person said publicly through Facebook or Twitter or others that could be considered, let's say, could be considered racist, sexist, because for someone to occupy that position, they need to demonstrate good judgment. And I'm not talking about issues related to their faith or political orientation, or political or sexual orientation. Those are issues, as was earlier pointed out, that are highly discriminatory. So when we do a social media check, we won't report to the client anything of that nature that would put the client at risk of being accused of discrimination. So, but we would never advocate asking a candidate for their codes, for their passwords. Frankly, that would be something that is absolutely no-no.
Thank you, David. So we don't have any other questions. We'd like to ask you for your help by answering a short evaluation, which we will display before you leave the webinar. Also, remember that the recording of this webinar, as well as the information presented, will be sent to the email that you used when you registered. Please don't hesitate to contact us with any questions that you have about this topic or MultiLatin solutions. Our phone numbers and email appear on the screen. On behalf of MultiLatin, thank you and have a good day.